A teraz, ako dobre viete, bude priestor na diskusiu, ako avizoval pán profesor. Máme necelú hodinu, takže dostatok času na vaše otázky. Kto bude mať záujem, môže sa prihlásiť. Dáme pokyn a mikrofón poputuje k vám v rukách nášho asistenta. Ak chcete, dobrovoľne sa môžete predstaviť a zároveň vás poprosím povedať, či budete klásť otázku v slovenčine alebo v angličtine. A poprosím využiť časový priestor maximálne 2 minúty, aby bol priestor na všetkých ostatných. Ďakujem, nech sa páči.
Takže Pavel Šimon v slovenčine. Otázka je krásna prednáška, ďakujem. A vidí v nejakej relatívne krátkej budúcnosti pán Friedman, že sa to aj stane, že bude mať stateless spoločnosť?
I think not entirely. That is to say, I think the sorts of things I'm describing might well develop online so that you may have parts of our life which is in effect a stateless society. In the long term, it is certainly possible, but I would be very surprised unless they solve the aging problem. I do not think I am going to see it.
You wrote the Machinery of Freedom in the 70s.
Yes.
And you can see like a result. For example, one Slovak economist, he wrote a book, translation is like a Progress Without Permission, and it's about the sharing economy and how the decentralized law is already established in many platforms. What is maybe you can see some of the sharing economy platforms and this kind of new law without the government. What do you like mostly, or what is in your mind when I mention this?
That is, the open source movement is one fairly obvious example where you have something developing which does not really depend on government, does not depend directly on the sort of ordinary market transactions, and yet it violates nobody's freedom and it produces very productive things. Eric Raymond has quite a good book on it, which is called The Cathedral and the Bazaar, discussing the difference between the centralized approach to doing software and the decentralized approach. So that would be one. But in general, I think one of the virtues of modern technology, and especially internet technology, is that it makes it easier to decentralize voluntary activities. That my last several books I self-published. I didn't need a publisher. Now it's true my editor was in-house because that's my daughter. On the other hand, I live in California and my cover artist lives in Florida. I've never even met her, but we are friends online. She's somebody who likes my writing, and so she's done covers for several of my self-published books. So that's a way of decentralizing the project of producing books, which is now becoming very common. Now, of course, most self-published books don't make any money, but then most of them wouldn't get commercially published anyway, and some of them do.
Hi, I'd like to ask if you see any way where a competition between governments could result in a better society, where, because oftentimes we hear that if you don't like it, you can leave, you know.
Right.
So, is there any way this could actually happen?
Yeah, it depends basically on the cost of moving. So that one of the futures I've imagined is, suppose most human activity moves online. Now you can move from one country to another while keeping the same job and the same friends. In that world, the cost of moving is very low, and so governments are becoming something more like a landlord than a government. You have to have some place you are, but if they don't offer you good terms, you go somewhere else. And my elder son, Patri, has pushed for some time the idea of seasteading, which is the idea that if you can develop a good technology for floating housing, for giant rafts that people live on, you then have very low costs of moving, because you have a cluster of such rafts, they're a town, the town developed its own legal rules, and if you decide you don't like it but you're being outvoted, you just call a tugboat, you pull your raft away, you find some other people who agree with you and create a new town. So that was his idea, following out some ideas of mine. In a sense, what I like about my son's approach, is that instead of asking the question, what kind of legal rules did you have, he asked the question, what environment would produce the right legal and political rules? And the answer is one in which competition among governments is very easy. And he's currently involved in running an investment fund for new city projects, for attempts to create sort of the equivalent of Hong Kong in various poor countries. And that would, again, if you think about a world where you can be under the same legal rules in some place in South America, and some place in Asia, and some place in the Middle East, and maybe some place in Europe, and you can then move among them, and the people running each of these sort of semi-independent societies inside a country have an incentive to try to create an environment that people want. So that's, I like to say that the ideal form of government is competitive dictatorship. And that's the way we run hotels and restaurants. That I have no vote at all in what's on the menu of the restaurant, but an absolute vote in which restaurant I go to. And that is where you can do it, it's a better system. And if we could, whether by seasteading or doing stuff online or something else, the closer we can get the international world to that situation, the better off we're going to be. And I should say that one large improvement, it's true a larger improvement for me than for you, but for you too, is the spread of English. The fact that you can now function in large parts of the world with only one language. Now it's pure luck for me that it's the language I already knew, but nonetheless, for the rest of you, you only have to learn one foreign language, and you now have a reasonable chance of finding who you can talk to in most parts of the world. So that's one of the ways in which I think things have gotten better.
Otázka bude v angličtine. Thank you very much, Mr. Friedman, for your presentation. My name is Dominik Alkes, and I'm studying currently at Communist University here in Bratislava. I would have two short questions to you. So you were talking about political markets, which to some extent are like private markets with political intervention. And my first question is whether carbon markets, which have become widespread at the end of the previous and in the 21st century, can we consider them as good examples of political markets? And my second question is, during my studies, I was focusing on the impact of new ideology that appeared at the end of the 1970s in the United States, and that's neoliberalism. So how neoliberalism impacts the environment. And one paradigm of neoliberalism is the simultaneous possibility of economic growth and environmental protection. And I want to ask you, how do you see whether is there a chance or a possibility towards transition to a climate neutral environment in an economic model that precisely prefers economic growth? Thank you.
If you believe that producing carbon dioxide has very large negative effects, that's an argument for either a cap and trade or a carbon tax system. And then the market that's produced by that is a private market, but it's a private market in rights that were created by the government. As it happens, I think that the underlying assumption is probably wrong. That is to say, I think if you actually take an objective look at climate change issues, you discover that while there are sizable negative effects, there are also sizable positive effects. And therefore, I am not convinced that the net is negative. It might be, because I think the size of both the positive and the negative effects is very uncertain. But that I think the current orthodoxy is the result of only thinking about negative effects and not looking at that positive effect. So, for example, take one of the ones that we know with great certainty. If you double the CO2 concentration of the atmosphere, the yield of many, though not all, food crops goes up by about 30%. That's because CO2 is an input to photosynthesis. For any biologists out there, that's true for C3 plants, but not for C4 plants. So it is not true for maize, which is the one really important C4 crops, but it's true for like wheat, rice, and most beans and things of that sort of. So that's a big positive, and you've got to put that against the various negatives. But if you believe that it's a problem, then indeed the carbon tax is the obvious. Either there's a practical problem, I should say, with regard to cap and trade, and that is that it's not clear how good a job you can do of actually monitoring what people are doing, knowing whether or not the carbon credits somebody is selling are real or imaginary. But that's true of lots of other contexts. anyway, I think the whole climate, I could give a different talk on climate change. And if people are curious enough, my current writing project is converting the ideas in about 14 years of blogs into a book or books. And I've been webbing the draft sections as I write them, and the draft section I'm working on at the moment is on climate, so you can find out why I think it's not clear. And I should say all of this is connected with the fact that, as the older people here may remember, if you go back about 50 years, population growth had exactly the same role in the public discourse that climate does now. That is to say, all of the expert people were telling us that population growth left terrible effects. In particular, it will make poor countries much poorer. And I got interested in that issue, and I wrote an article, wrote a piece on it, and I tried to estimate the effects of having one more person. And I concluded that there were positive effects and negative effects, and I couldn't tell which was larger, that the sign of the sum was indefinite. I still don't know which was larger, but we know that the claims that were being made then were false because it didn't happen. That population continued to grow, especially in poor countries, and yet poor countries got substantially richer. The amount of extreme poverty in the world has fallen very sharply in the last 30 or 40 years. The nutrition in poor countries has gotten substantially better over that time. So that's one of the reasons that I was sort of suspicious of the climate orthodoxy, was that I felt as though I'd already been through one round of the same pattern when some view about a looming catastrophe becomes fashionable, and if it's fashionable, then people who don't believe in it mostly keep their mouths shut, except for a few very brave people, and you then end up with it looking as though it's all.
Thank you very much. Please, Pastor.
Otázka bude v slovenčine. Dobrý večer, pán Friedman, ja sa volám Geze. Hovorili ste, že voliči sa rozhodujú na základe informácií, ale je taký problém, že približne polovica našich politikov klame, tak nielen našich, je to asi celosvetový problém. Tiež sú aj rôzne alternatívne médiá, ktoré klamú, a dokonca aj kvázi politológovia klamú ľudí, tak čiže potom sa rozhodnú zle tí voliči. Ja sa chcem vás spýtať, že ako zabrániť, a respektíve ako zabezpečiť pre voličov pravdivé informácie.
It's a good question, but I'm afraid I don't have a good answer for it. That part of the problem we face is that almost everybody is heavily dependent on secondhand information. Even if you're a climate scientist, you don't really know enough to know whether climate change is a problem, because you only know the small part of the problem you've looked at. And you are relying on trusting other people who have looked at other parts of the problem and therefore have given results. And that's similarly true in pretty nearly every field. And one of the results is that what you believe depends on who you trust. And one of the things that comes out, most notably in the US at present, but probably other places, is that you get societies divided between people where half of the people are sure X is true and half are sure X is false, and none of them are lying. That is, somebody may be lying to them, but in each case, they have a set of people that they trust, and they are basing their opinions as they have to on those opinions. So I've sometimes said that Fauci is responsible for the fact that half the Republicans think that Trump won the election. And what do I mean by that? I mean that if you don't trust any sources of authoritative information, then it's natural enough to believe what you want to believe. And if you were a Trump supporter, you wanted to believe he won. Well, Mr. Fauci has publicly stated that he lies. He never put it that way. But there's a New York Times interview where he explains that he's changing his estimate of what's required for herd immunity. Not in response to medical evidence, but in response to polling evidence. That the number of people who are willing to get vaccinated has changed, so he's going to change what people tell them about the scientific fact of what's needed for herd immunity. Well, that means that not only is he willing to lie to people, he's willing to admit lying to people. Perfectly reasonable response to that is to say, well, he and people like him are not reliable sources of information, so why shouldn't I believe what I want to believe? So that, I think, is a very serious problem. I'm not sure I can see anything to do about it. You could do about it. Now, what you can do as an individual is to try to develop techniques for figuring out who you should believe. So that I've long argued that one of the educational skills that is badly undertaught in our society is evaluating sources of information on internal evidence. So you read an article which says X, and the question is, to what extent can you figure out whether you should believe it by how it's written? Does the article offer all the strongest arguments you can think of against X and then respond to them? Or does it just act as though there are no arguments against it, there are only arguments for it, any idiot's got to believe it, and so forth? So you've got to train yourself to be able to recognize people who are trying to snow you, and you can't do it perfectly, but you can do it much better than most people do. And in fact, one of my complaints about the standard approach to K through 12 schooling in both public and private schools is that it is anti-teaching that skill. Because what do you have? You are given two sources of information, the teacher and the textbook, and you're told to believe them. That's a very foolish thing to do to children. What you want to do is to tell the people, here, there are a whole bunch of sources of information. How do you figure which ones to believe? Much harder problem, but a much more useful skill. And one of the nice things about arguing online is that anybody who isn't brain dead figures out fairly rapidly that the fact that somebody says something online doesn't mean it's true, because it's an open medium, and therefore you've got to try to develop the skill of filtering out truth for false. You can't do it perfectly. You can do a good deal of it.
Thank you very much. Nech sa páči.
Moja otázka bude v angličtine. Well, Mr. Friedman, thank you for your presentation. And now, my name is Samuel, and I study law here at the Comenius University, and I would like to ask if you or your father have had in the past any opinion on something from economy or law that you've later changed. If yes, what was the opinion and why?
Sure, that's a good question. And the best answer I can think of has to do with how the private economy is structured. Because some of the same arguments against centralized control also look like arguments against corporations, and especially large corporations. And the one big difference is that large corporations in a market can only survive if they are doing a good enough job of coordination so that the advantages of size outweigh the disadvantages. And when I first wrote Machinery of Freedom, I was much more sympathetic to the idea of an economy where everybody was a freelance. What somebody described as an agoric economy. And you could certainly imagine an economy run that way, where you don't have employees, where you've got contracting among people in order to do things. And I know more than I did then. In particular, I've read a pretty good discussion of the way in which that was done in some areas of the 19th century and what were the problems that arose. And I have now read Ronald Coase's book, one of his two famous articles, The Theory of the Firm, in which he points out that if the arguments against centralized economic planning were really as strong as our people thought they were, there'd be no firms, because a firm is doing the same thing on a smaller scale. And he explains in some detail why there's really a trade-off in running organizations between the costs of doing it through the market, where you've got to do bargaining and negotiating, transacting and so forth, and the costs of doing it through hierarchy, where you've got to watch what people are doing and figure what they should do. So I am much less in favor of an agoric economy. I still like it. I still feel as though it's more fun being an independent. One interesting thing happened to me a couple of days ago in Prague. I was in an Uber and got in a conversation with the driver, who it turned out was from North Africa, but had been living in Prague for 17 years because he married a Czech wife. And the reason he was living in Prague was that he did speak Czech and she didn't speak Arabic. And they had two kids, a nice guy, interesting person. And I asked him what things he'd done other than driving an Uber. And he said, well, he'd been an accountant for Delta Airlines. And I said, you know, how does that compare to being an Uber? And he says, I like freedom. He said, freedom is expensive. That is to say, he presumably makes less money driving an Uber than he did working for Delta, but he doesn't have to show up at 9 o'clock in the morning and work till 3 or 5 or whatever. 9 to 5, I guess, would be traditional. And I thought that was very interesting. This was sort of a random person who had chosen the advantages of the more nearly agoric system, the system where he drives when he wants to and doesn't drive when he doesn't want to, over the advantages of being part of the hierarchy.
Very much. Kto ďalší má záujem, nech sa páči.
Dobrý deň. Ja by som mal takú otázku, že voľakedy na dedine, keď sa volil richtár, tak vždy zvolili toho najlepšieho gazdu. No a teraz, lebo samozrejme všetci vedeli, že budú znášať náklady jeho rozhodovania. A teraz sa spýtam takto, či ste sa zaoberali otázkou, že ako by sa zmenila efektivita štátu, keby o ňom rozhodovali len tí, ktorí platia dane. Čiže znášajú náklady fungovania toho štátu.
I'm not sure I understand your point. I thought what you were going to say was that in a very small village, the information costs of knowing which mayor candidate is honest and competent are much lower than they are when it's the president of the country. And therefore you would expect small governments to work much better than big government, which is probably true. But I'm not sure I understand the point you were making, because even if the mayor or the president pays taxes, the benefits and costs are not the same as for the whole country. So he would, if he pays the taxes, he would choose not to do things. If he's paying the taxes, he would choose not to do things.
Excuse me, strátili sme sa v preklade. Takto, ja hovorím o tom, že tí, ktorí volia, voliči, budú len tí, ktorí platia dane. To znamená, že znášajú náklady štátu.
Net contributors.
Yeah, you certainly could have such a rule. There probably have been places where you did have such a rule. But it doesn't really solve the problems, because even if I pay taxes, I'm in favor of government things which tax other people to benefit me. I may be against even good things that tax me to benefit other people. I have no incentive to be well informed, because it's still the case that my vote has a very small chance of changing the outcome. It is still the case that if I do change the outcome, most of the benefit goes to other people, not to me, because we get a better law or a better mayor or president or whatever. So I have no strong opinion on whether what you're suggesting would be an improvement, but it's not a solution.
Thank you very much. Ďalšie to vidím tam v strede, dámo.
Hello, Mr. Friedman. I'm Tatiana. I studied at the University of Economics a long time ago. And my question is, I have two questions actually. One thing I would like to ask, how do you define freedom? What's freedom for you? Like, how do you work with it? And then the second is, I am very interested in, because you are an old, you are like a older economist who has worked in this field for a long time, so I know that you have much more information than me and than most of us. And there is this thing that I know, and we all, I think, who have studied economy know that we are all working in a world that depends on economic growth, right? GDP is the holy grail, I believe, or it's a very important indicator. And now I have a question that if you think that the world as we live now is going to continue based on the same principles as it did when you were growing up and when you were getting older. And I'm asking this because of the limits, the planetary limits. Like, we know that if the economy grows by 3% in a year, in 24 years the economy doubles, and it goes like this. And there is a planet which has certain limits, and I just want to know if you think it's possible for us to continue this way. Thank you very much.
I think it is possible to continue growth. I don't think it is true that having a happy world requires growth, but growth means that people are getting a little bit more of what they want each year, and you could have a reasonably tolerable world in which there was no growth and we just stayed at our present level. I'd just rather go to a higher level. But I think what you're saying is along the lines of what the people who were claiming that population was a terrible problem 50 years ago were saying. And I think probably the best answer is the most visible critic of that movement was Julian Simon. And he wrote a book called The Ultimate Resource. And the ultimate resource is people. That if you think about it, I did a calculation back when population was an issue for my own curiosity. I worked out population densities of different countries. And because the picture people had was that the reason some countries were poor was they were overpopulated. And they were thinking of places like India and China. But India and China do not, in fact, have high population densities. They've got large populations, but they're very large countries. And at the time when I did the calculation, the 5 most densely populated countries in the world consisted of 2 rich Western countries and 3 countries that were in the process of becoming rich, those being Taiwan, South Korea, and Singapore. Singapore had a much higher population density than anybody else, and Hong Kong, which wasn't a country, had about 10 times the population density of Singapore. And from the end of World War II to something like 1980 or so, Hong Kong went from desperately poor with huge inflow of immigrants to richer than England. So I think people are the major resource. That if people think of the world as densely populated, but that's because you're averaging over people, not acres. That is, if you think about your mental picture of how densely populated the world is, you get it from looking around you. But of course, you're not in random places. You're in places there are people, because you're a person. And therefore, people's mental picture of density, I think, is badly exaggerated. But I don't think it's the case. I don't know whether we will continue to grow. There are lots of other reasons that we might not. But I don't think that we're going to run out of resources in any meaningful sense. That if some resources get scarce, then people substitute others. They recycle. There are various ways in which in a market you can respond to that problem. And as you may know, back when this was an issue, Julian Simon made a bet with somebody who was arguing the other side on what would happen to the price of various resources over time. Because the claim was that we've got fixed amounts of scarce resources, and as there are more people, they'll be bidding their price up. And Julian Simon thought the opposite, and he won the bet and collected about $5,000 or whatever the amount was that they had. Now, I'm trying to remember, because you had a very long question. I'm trying to remember, what was the first half of it?
How do you define freedom?
Ah, yes, that's a good question. Yes, I guess I think of freedom as my being able to control what I do as long as I am not harming other people. So, from my standpoint, freedom, as I understand, does not include things like having food to eat. That depends on somebody else producing food and being willing to sell it to me, or my growing it, or whatever. And freedom does not include the right to have people hire me. But freedom does include the right to not get hired if I don't want to, the right to hire anybody who's willing to be hired by me, to buy from anybody who's willing to sell for me, and so forth. So I think there is a concept of freedom which from my standpoint is confusing freedom and power. It is clear that I am better off if I can get things. I'm better off if I'm richer. I'm better off if people will deal with me. But that isn't what I think of as freedom. That's a different desirable thing. And the freedom is that other people are not themselves constricting what I can do.
Thank you very much. Kto další má záujem? Vidím.
Hi David, this is Jaro. My name is Jaro. Thank you for the presentation. I think you had a lot of arguments against the big governments. But when I look at the world, what I see is that the government is growing almost everywhere. And what is, in your opinion, the incentive for the governments to grow? Why they are? Because if I'm politician, I'm in lower government means less work for me. So it doesn't make sense. Could that be something like control of the people? But why would they do it? I mean, what is the real root cause for this? Could that be maybe a free money, or could?
It's an interesting question, especially over historical time, because in the 19th century, both the U.S. and the UK, governments were spending a total of about 10% of national income. And nowadays, depending on where you are, it's between about 30 and 50%. And the question is, why did that change? I don't know. But one possibility is that it changed because it became easier to tax people. That if you're taxing a farmer, it is relatively easy for him to hide income. That he feeds the crop to his pigs instead of selling it, he sells it to his neighbor. On the other hand, if you're an employee of IBM, IBM is keeping track of how much they pay you, it's easy to get. So I think one of several reasons may well be that the world economy has shifted in the direction of more people being employees of firms, and that lowered the difficulty of collecting taxes. I don't know if that's the right answer, but it could be an answer. But there could be a lot of other possibilities which are why governments grow. And I'm not sure it's true that governments have always grown. I think that's probably varied from century to century, as it were. But certainly in our lifetime, that's been the general trend.
Thanks.
Yes, Mr. Friedman, I would like to ask you a question about the issue of vaccines, because you already mentioned the vaccination process in the United States and elsewhere. Do you think that the world, especially Western world, I mean Europe and United States, would survive until this time without any vaccines being available for people? Because me personally, I think yes, because I did some mathematical count at home that even it was many people who died, it was just 0.4% of people who died of COVID. What do you think about this issue?
I think if there had been no vaccine, the world would have survived. It's just more people would have died. That roughly speaking, as I say, I looked at the numbers for me, and it looked as though if I got COVID, I had about a 3% chance of dying. But I'm in my 70s, and for somebody in 30 or 40, it was much less than 1%. For a child, it was like 1,000th of a percent or something on that order, a very small number. So if we'd never had any vaccine, the disease would have kept going until enough people had it so that you got herd immunity, which is maybe, we don't know, maybe 80% or something like that. So take 80% times the average mortality, and that would have been sizably less than 1% of the population. So I think if we have no vaccine, that something between 1/10 of a percent and 1% of the population, let's see, the world population is about 8 billion, so 1% is about 80 million, so you would have had something like 8 million, 8, 20, that kind, some kind of number like that of people dying, and that sounds pretty terrible, but it's a very small part of the world population. That people tend to over-dramatize all of these things. I've seen a fairly well-informed discussion of what happens if we have a nuclear war, and the conclusion is it will not come close to wiping out the human race. It will kill very large numbers of people. It will probably kill something in the hundreds of millions. But it isn't the case, as people like to dramatize in the past, that if you have a nuclear war, it dies. It doesn't seem to be the case. It doesn't give me any good evidence for that. But it makes a much better story. And of course, that's part of the issue with climate change. That part of what's happening with climate change is sort of ideological, and part of it is if you're making a newspaper story, people are much more likely to read a story which says that in 30 years, New York City will be flooded, which is wildly exaggerated, but it makes a great story. You can have somebody do a picture of what New York City would look like with the water rising up by the skyscrapers and so forth. So that's one of the problems, going back to the question of how you discover what's true, is that many of our information sources are biased in a variety of directions. Some of them politically biased, some of them are biased towards making good stories, some of them are probably biased in ways I haven't thought about yet.
Thank you very much. Nech sa páči.
Ja som chcel len doplniť takú jednu poznámku k tej pôvodnej otázke, že prečo vlády v 20. storočí rastú. Pán Friedman určite pozná Thomasa Sowella, The Vision of Anointed, vízia pomazaných, vlastne zostup intelektuálnej triedy, hej, alebo prípadne Schumpetera, kapitalizmus, socializmus a demokracia. Vlastne to by bola odpoveď, že vlastne v 20. storočí došlo k obrovskému rastu intelektuálnej triedy, ktorá vymýšľa fundamentálne spoločenské zmeny. Hej. To je to Misesovek, kto nie je schopný ľuďom slúžiť, ktorým chce vládnuť. Neviem, či toto by nebolo, hej, či toto nie je odpoveď. Aký má na to prípadne názor?
I don't know. There are lots of things I don't know, unfortunately. That is, I think ideological belief matters, but it goes back and forth. That is to say, when I was in college, a lot of people really believed that centrally planned socialism worked. That Samuelson, the most successful economics text, kept saying that the USSR was catching up with the US. And the odd thing was that addition by addition, the date when they were going to catch up with us kept pushing ahead by about the length of time between editions, because they weren't actually catching up. That belief is largely gone. As far as I can tell, modern people who call themselves socialists mostly are in favor of welfare state capitalism, of the more or less Scandinavian pattern. There aren't a lot of people who are in favor of real socialism anymore. That's an improvement. At the same time, environmentalism has arisen as a substitute for socialism, in that it's a new way of making arguments for governments making people do things. And lots of people would like to make other people do things, whether for their own interest or because they think they know what's good for other people better or whatever. And in practice, although the environmental argument is a rationally better argument than the socialist one was, because there really are market failures involved, in practice it ends up as sort of a blank check for whatever you want to make people do, and that's the respect in which things have gotten worse.
Watermelons, outside green, inside red.
Inside, maybe.
Nech sa páči, do ďalšie má záujem, tam idem dáma v strede.
Thank you very much for the presentation. My name is Martin, I'm a student of political sciences. And I have a question connected to the story you were telling about your son, about those clusters of houses that are basically auto-governing themselves. And I wanted to ask you, to which extent do you think decentralization is the answer? Or what do you think about giving more decision-making power to local governments? If this can be the first step to some improvement? Thank you.
Yeah, I think on the whole, having more decision-making power to local government is usually a gain for two different reasons. One is that the information costs of knowing who to vote for are somewhat lower on a smaller scale, and the other is that the costs of moving among cities are much lower than moving among countries, and therefore you get a larger element of competition among governments. So that seems to be a good idea, but I don't think it's going to solve everything, unfortunately.
Nech sa páči, kto ďalší má záujem? No, nobody. Igor, nech sa páči. Podľavu.
Hey David, my name is Juraj. First and foremost, it's really a pleasure that you are here. Thank you for the great keynote. I have one question. I think it's a fairly simple one. So when people argue, especially when you argue with a lot of statists, you eventually get to the point where they ask you, so show me the real anarchism in our current empirical world, right? Can you show me some examples? My two favorite ones, one is in connection with the nation states, which basically live in the state of perpetual anarchism, and the second one has to do with language and how it was created and formed. Can you give me some more examples of additional ones?
For that one, I actually have part of a poem in Machinery of Freedom is on the language subject. I speak a word and people understand, although it must be gibberish since words are not designed by governmental plan. That's in one of the Machinery of Freedom. I wrote a poem for each section as the introductory thing. That's on that one. But other examples, well, there's a sense in which the marriage market is anarchist, that we, you know, it's true, you sort of feel as though when you fall in love with a woman and she turns you down, you ought to be able to get the government to make her marry you. But fortunately, you can't. And of course, you could say it doesn't work very well, so there are lots of people who aren't happily married, but nonetheless, that is an essentially anarchist arrangement. The open source software is one I mentioned, which is essentially anarchist in that sense. There are various communities, what I think of as embedded law, communities which are under an existing legal system but mostly avoid it and run things themselves. And some of those are in one sense or another anarchist. I think that the Roma are largely, the Roma's own system is largely anarchist, depending on which Roma group it is, but they're not all the same. What are other good examples? I don't know, I have to think about that.
Maybe could you say more about example from Ireland in 10th, 20th century?
But you want to know about modern ones?
Maybe older, maybe.
That is there. If you want discussion of historical stateless societies, my book, Legal Systems Very Different from Ours, has a discussion of the Icelandic system, the Irish, which we don't know as much about, unfortunately, the Romani. The Amish aren't really anarchists, I don't think, although, well, so it's a little unclear how you classify the Amish, because the Amish, an Amish community has authority over you only after you've voluntarily chosen to join. But anyway, so I discuss a number of those there.
Thank you for your lecture. That was very interesting. I have a more personal question. Your background is in theoretical physics, yeah? You studied physics. So how do you transition from such theoretical fields into more economic-oriented and law, and becoming then a law professor? How does that happen?
I was a postdoc at Columbia, and I concluded that I was more interested in economics and was better at it than physics, having done both. I was the head of the Population Council, which is a private organization, wanted to see a discussion of population issues that was from a pro-free market side. I don't think that was his own view, but he thought it would be, that you ought to have both sides represented, as it were. And he asked me to do a piece, and so I did a piece in which I was trying to figure out whether the net effect of having one more person was positive or negative on other people. And I concluded I couldn't tell. And it was interesting. And then somebody who had maybe seen that, I'm not sure, who was running a semi-independent center at University of Pennsylvania, the Fels Center, offered to find me a postdoc position there if I wanted to switch fields. So I spent 2 years as a postdoc at the Fels Center at Penn, then 1 year as a lecturer at Penn. During that time, I wrote an article on, which was a theory of the size and shape of nations, and it was published in the Journal of Political Economy. Most doctoral theses either don't get published or get published in minor journals. So in a sense, publishing an article in a top journal was a better qualification than a doctorate in economics. And the fact that I'd gotten a doctorate in another field showed that I was willing to do the necessary work. I then, in some context, ran into Jim Buchanan, who was in the process of developing public choice theory, which in a sense was what my Size of Nations piece was, although from a different angle than he was doing. And he invited me to come to VPI as an assistant professor of economics, having taken no economics. And at the time, his colleague, Gordon Tullock, who was one of my favorite people, used to say that he had published more pages of economics than had been assigned in all of the courses he had taken. And I told Gordon that I achieved that with my first page.
No, vidím, že tu vpredu v prvom rade je tu otázka. V prvom rade.
Mr. Friedman, I would like to know which ideas of your father influenced you most in your works and or your career?
Yeah, that's a very hard question, because the sort of theoretical things he made important contributions to are mostly in macroeconomics, which isn't what I do. So I would say his general approach to life and the world had a large influence that I've noticed that I am perhaps unreasonably shocked when I discover people are not being honest. What I sometimes refer to as my loss of innocence, which was when I was maybe in my very early 20s, maybe 22 or so, and I spent a summer as a congressional intern in Washington. And my congressman let me out 4 days a week to the Joint Economic Committee. And they lent me to a project which was creating a fact book on state and local finance. And this organization was simultaneously part of George Washington University, a part of the Joint Economic Committee, a part of the Governor's Conference, but it was the same group of people with a bunch of different hats. And I discovered a fact relevant to state and local finance. And it was a fact which was unquestionably true, because it was a fact about demographics, about people who had already been born, about the size of different generations. It was a fact that was unquestionably important because it dealt with the largest single expenditure of state and local government, which is schooling, education. And the people running it refused to include the fact in their fact book. They didn't deny it was true, because the implication of the fact was that state and local governments would have lower requirements for money than before, and they wanted people to believe they needed more money. I found that shocking. The fact that professional academics were willing to be deliberately dishonest in the work they were doing. And that was partly because I had been brought up in an environment where you didn't do that sort of thing, where it was just taken for granted that you were obliged to be honest. And along similar lines, on a sort of a smaller scale, that my father never said to me, I'm right and you're wrong because I'm the grown-up. That would have been heresy. And many years ago, I heard, actually, my wife's father, who was an elderly man, generally a pretty sensible person, I think, tell my younger son, don't contradict your elders. And that struck me as a horrible thing to say, that if you think your elders are wrong, you should contradict them. And if you're wrong, and I think my son was in fact wrong in a particular issue, then you show him why he's wrong. You don't use authority. So that's sort of, I think, the important things that I learned, was a sort of general attitude to the world.
My name is Jan Ravec, and unfortunately I'm old enough to remember a nice lunch I had together with your father and with Rose Friedman 20 years ago in San Francisco. And one of the things we have debated during that lunch actually was the growth of the government and the way how to prevent it. And your first book was about the stateless society. Don't you want to borrow the first part of the famous Hayek's book, The Road to Serfdom? Don't you want to borrow that first part of the title and to write the book, The Road to Stateless Society?
No.
That would be a nice complementary book to your first book.
My general approach to intellectual activity is fire and forget. I think it is a mistake, having written one thing, to then spend the rest of your life defending it. So my first article was on the size and shape of nations. I'm still proud of it. I think it was a very clever article. I saw somebody did an article on the literature on that. Mine is the first article in that literature. The second one is by Jim Buchanan about 10 years later. And after that, people wrote books and various other things on the topic. I've never gone back to the subject. So, as a general rule, I would rather do new things. Now, it's true I did do a third edition of Machinery, but it had been out for like 40 or 50 years by then. And that was because I had some new ideas that had occurred to me relevant to what was in it. But in general, I don't see any reason why, having written one book, I should write another one that duplicates it, even with a clever title.
Šimon, a skúsim slovensky. Inflak. Na základe vášho výzdomu, vašej skúsenosti, ako vidíte vy budúcnosť Európskej únie?
That's a good question. I don't have a good answer to it. I think the original idea of a European common market was a great idea, and trying to convert it into a United States of Europe was a terrible idea. I think there'd be much to be said for converting the United States into multiple countries. But what will happen, I don't know. That it's facing some very serious strains. One major country has already pulled out, and it is possible that other countries will. So it's possible that it'll collapse. If it doesn't collapse, it's going to keep growing into becoming more and more of a government with more and more control over people. Those seem to be the alternatives, unfortunately.
I would have one additional more question. So you were talking previously about, and also I mentioned carbon markets, and the idea was, which led the carbon markets to spread basically all over the world, was the commodification of nature, so making nature or treating nature as tradable commodities. And I would like to ask you, you also have talked about market failures, and so do you think that the protection of environment is not, or environmental protection is not so unique and so clear, and that's because it's not in all interests to search for the costs and benefits as well. So like politicians do not really see the costs and the benefits of their own actions.
I'm not sure I understand the question about what it has to do with modification of nature.
So, economists tend to argue when they speak about global markets that if there is like a huge demand for a clear and sustainable nature, then there will be a huge supply. And
but are you talking about politics or markets? In terms of markets, you can have a demand for nature produce a supply only to the extent that individuals can, as it were, that you can treat it as property. So that if demand for nature means lots of people would like to walk through the woods, then that's a market incentive for people to buy up lots of woodland and sell parks with admission charges. And that's going to happen. But if what you're talking about is government rules, then you've got the usual problem. There's no particular reason to expect them to do a sensible job of producing valuable things at minimal costs and such. One of the weird things, if you think about the whole global warming thing, is that it is reasonably clear whether or not the net effects are positive or negative, that the effects are going to be much more positive for some countries than others. That, in particular, it's reasonably clear that Canada will be better off with global warming. It's reasonably clear the Scandinavian countries will be, because large parts of their territory are very cold. I mean, Canada, in effect, is, 50 miles wide and 2,000 miles long, because it's the stuff above the border which is usually warm enough to live in. And I could imagine that by the end of this century, Canada's effective size will be 3 or 4 times as big. And yet Canada is one of the countries that does expensive things to try to prevent global warming. So that it really feels more like a religion than like a market, in a sense, that some people are convinced that it is virtuous to hold down carbon, and therefore their governments do things to hold down carbon, but it doesn't have a whole lot to do with whether it's in their interest. Now, I should say, at the risk of saying something positive about Mr. Putin, that my theory of Putin's view of global warming is he may pretend he doesn't believe in global warming, but what's really going on is he can read a map. That very large parts of Russia would be better off if they were a few degrees warmer. And therefore it is perfectly reasonable for Putin, if he wants his own country to prosper, to think it would be a fine thing if we had some climate change. But he's not willing to say that, I don't think.
Thank you very much. And please, for last question.
Thank you. My name is Slavomir and I'm a lawyer. So my question is, do we need law in a stateless society? And if so, what kind of law and who should pass it? Thank you.
We certainly need law, but we don't need uniform law. That is to say, what I would expect to happen in the stateless society is that each private court, each arbitration agency, will have a set of legal rules. There will be some tendency for them to be similar across courts, but they don't have to be. And that part of the advantage of that system is that the law itself is being generated on a competitive market. That if my arbitration agency can think of an improvement in legal rules, a change in the legal rules such that most people would rather be under the new and improved rules, they can make money by making that change. Because when they make that change, more enforcement agencies will want to patronize them. So whereas we are currently producing our law by a socialist mechanism, that is to say by having government generated, what I'm describing is actually generating a market for producing law.
Thank you very much.
Yes, maybe last question.
Very well.
You are in Slovakia, so we are a post-socialistic country, and we can feel it, like in our personalities, in our decisions, like in our entrepreneur, or like a fear or lack of entrepreneurship here in Slovakia, because people are like employees, or they don't like they don't like entrepreneurship. And I think that it's like a result of socialism. So we have like we are a small country. We don't have sea, we don't have oil, we don't have lithium. But what we can do, like this small country, maybe in like this, maybe in digital economy, or in which part, what we can be like much better. I'm not like I don't want to central planning of economy for next 5 years, but like in a context of spontaneous order.
But I would say what you can do is to have as free an economy as possible, as low taxes as possible, and thus compete to, you're in the EU, so that means anybody else in the EU can come to Slovakia and start a business. And if you make Slovakia the very best place in the world for entrepreneurs to function, you ought to be able to attract some entrepreneurs. And if you can't produce them yourself, you just import them.
Thank you very much. Náš čas sa pomaly teda naplnil. Pevne verím, že to bol pre vás užitočne strávený čas. Veľmi pekne vám ďakujem, že ste prišli, že ste kladli otázky niektorí z vás. Ďakujem ešte raz partnerom a osobitne ďakujem pánovi profesorovi za jeho prednášku a vyčerpávajúce odpovede. Dear professor, thank you very much for your lecture and discussion. Thank you.